Hi, everybody, and welcome back to Found. So, when we left off, chapter 18, we finally get a chance to talk to Angela Dupre. And Angela Dupre tells them something that is a little shocking, probably a little hard to understand. So, I'm going to repeat it again just so we can have it fresh in our minds. She says, I mean that Chip and Jonah used to be much older than they are now, Angela said. I think they were changed by traveling through time. I think they and all of the other babies came from the future. So we start there with chapter 19. Silence. Dead silence. Jonah wasn't even really thinking about what Angela had said because it was too bizarre and incredible to consider. It was like his brain shut down, rejecting her theory so completely. After a few moments, he thought to look at Chip and Catherine to see how they were reacting. Mostly, he was concerned they'd be all rude and mocking and mean to Angela, when clearly she was just a nutcase. Oh, sure, she seemed fairly reasonable at first, except for being scared to talk on the phone. But believing in time travel and babies aging backwards, insanity. Chip and Catherine both had their mouths open already, though Chip's might have just been hanging open in shock. Well, thanks for meeting with us, Jonah said quickly, hoping he could get everyone away from Angela before Catherine had a chance to speak. Your ideas are, very interesting. He was struggling for words, trying to think of a polite excuse to leave. Could he carry off, oh my, look at the time? Suddenly, something slammed into the glass door next to Jonah. Instinctively, Jonah grabbed the door handle, but it was too late. A man was wedging his heavily booted foot between the door and the glass wall. The rest of the man's body was sprawled out on the ground because another man appeared to have tackled him. You can't do this, the tackler was screaming. No, not exactly screaming. He was keeping his voice down, barely above a whisper, but his words still echoed with fury. Not here, not now. You'll make a scene. Do you want to ruin time completely? Jonah shoved against the man's boot. He drove his shoulder against the door, trying to shut it against the man's ankle. He couldn't see the man's face because the tackler blocked his view. Then the tackler turned, and Jonah could at least see him clearly. A jolt of recognition flowed through his body, and he was so stunned he almost let go of the door. The tackler was the janitor from the FBI, the one who told Jonah to look at the file on Mr. Reardon's desk. Jonah, Chip, run, the tackler called urgently, struggling with the man in the boots. What good was that? There was nowhere to run to, except out the door where the men were fighting. The booted man reared up, almost breaking the tackler's grip. Catherine shrieked. The window, Angela said. She rushed over to the outer wall and began tugging on the window handle. Chip jumped up and helped her. The window opened inward, making a very narrow V with the wall. Chip dived out through the small space, barely missing landing in a holly bush. Catherine followed him quickly, executing a gymnastic-like move at the end when she flipped over onto her feet. Jonah, come on, she yelled through the open window. Jonah looked back at the men struggling on the ground. What would happen if he stopped holding the door? Go, the tackler called over his shoulder. Jonah ran for the window, skirting the table. He looked back once and saw that the men had rolled into the conference room. He still couldn't see the booted man's face, but he had a general impression of a lot of bulk, of a lot of muscles. He wasn't sure the tackler could hold him. You go first, Angela, Jonah said. The name seemed to trigger a reaction in the tackler. He jerked his head back, looking over the top of the conference table. Angela Dupre, he called. We have wronged you in time. We owe you a... The tackler's head suddenly disappeared beneath the tabler. The booted man must have pulled him down. There was a sound like somebody's head was clunking against the floor, and the table lurched sideways. Angela, Jonah urged. He held out his hand to help her out the window. She was wearing a skirt. She probably wouldn't even want to go head first. Angela drew back. You go on, she said. I have been waiting 13 years for something like this. I'm going to stick around and I'm going to get some answers. But they're dangerous, Jonah protested. He couldn't see the men at all now, but he could hear them, grunting, punching, slamming into chairs and the table. Probably, Angela said, and that's why you need to get out of here. She pushed him towards the window. He grabbed onto the frame, spreading his fingers against the glass to brace himself as he slid his feet out. Go, Jonah, the tackler called from beneath the table. Hurry, and Jonah, I saw your note. You have to be more careful. You have to be careful where you leave anything that could be seen later, anything that could be monitored. That was all Jonah heard, because he was out the window now, and the tackler was still using that low voice of hushed urgency. Jonah looked back, and he could see the tackler clearly now, under the table. He had one hand pressed against the other man's hair, holding his head down, and with the other hand the tackler was frantically waving Jonah away. His mouth was forming the words, "Go, go now," but Jonah couldn't hear him. Jonah spun around and ran. He quickly caught up with Chip and Catherine. Without even speaking, all three of them ran for the bike rack. They scooped up their bikes and took off, pedaling furiously. They were halfway down the bike path before Jonah's mind kicked into gear, letting him think again instead of just acting on reflex. He immediately slammed on his brakes. Chapter 20. Catherine was the first to notice that Jonah wasn't keeping up, that he wasn't pedaling hysterically towards home with her and Chip. "Jonah," she called over her shoulder from several bike lengths ahead. "What are you doing?" "I have to go back," he yelled. "We can't just leave Angela like that." "But she's a grown-up. She told us to go." That was Chip arguing now. Jonah decided he didn't have time to stand here and argue. He whirled around and began pedaling back towards the library just as desperately as he had been pedaling away from it. Grown-ups can get kidnapped too, he thought. And she looked a little nutty, but she'd probably trust anybody who pretended to believe that crazy theory. I mean, her theories have to be craziness, right? Jonah couldn't think about that right now. He focused on trying to pedal faster. By the time he reached the library, his legs were aching and he was gasping for air. He dropped his bike on the sidewalk and slipped in the door just ahead of a mother pushing the baby stroller and holding a toddler's hand, taking infuriatingly slow steps with a play-by-play commentary. "Yup, that's right," she said. "You push the button and the door opens." Jonah dashed through the lobby, past the checkout. "Young man, no running in the library," the librarian yelled. It was the librarian, the one that his mom always said hello to when she stepped in. Jonah thought maybe the librarian had been in charge of story hour when he and Catherine were just preschoolers. "It's just the conference room. There were men fighting and in danger." That was all Jonah could manage because his lungs were threatening to burst. To her credit, the librarian stopped yelling and sprang into action. "Show me," she said. She rushed along behind Jonah, practically running herself. They dashed through the stacks, past the magazine section where Catherine had hidden before, past the nonfiction shelves with all the thick books, and there finally Jonah could see into the conference room, and it was empty. "Angela?" Jonah called. He pushed his way into the conference room. Not only was the room empty, but all the chairs were lined up perfectly around the table. The table was exactly centered in the room, like it had never been knocked off kilter by struggling men. The window was closed. The only sign that anything had happened here was a smudge on the glass wall, and that was probably Jonah's own fingerprints, smeared against the glass when he scrambled out the window. "Just what did you think was going on in here?" the librarian asked. She had her eyebrows raised doubtfully. Just then Jonah saw a movement out of the corner of his eye. He turned his head to peer out the window, and there was Angela. She was walking briskly through the far end of the parking lot. "That's the woman," Jonah exclaimed, "the one who was in danger." While Jonah was watching, Angela stepped into the cluster of pine trees on the other side of the parking lot. She turned and lifted her hand in a way that might have been a wave at Jonah, and then she vanished. Jonah didn't know it would look like that. He had heard Catherine's description of the janitor appearing and disappearing. He heard Angela's description of the plane doing the same thing, but he didn't understand how strange it would be, how it would make him question all sorts of things about how the world worked. Could gravity be tampered with? Could time? Jonah blinked and stammered, but, and then he at least had the sense to shut his mouth. Already, the librarian was looking at him oddly, and already his brain was trying to supply explanations for him. She just stepped behind a tree, maybe. Maybe you just blinked and you thought you saw something you didn't. It was the same kind of explanations he tried to use for Catherine's story, and for Angela's. The kind of explanation that anyone else, casually glancing out of a window, would have accepted without a second thought. But his glance wasn't casual. He knew he didn't blink. Not while Angela was disappearing. He understood now what Angela had meant when she said, "I know what I saw, and I trust my own eyes." The scene had been clear and distinct, and really, he had seen Angela vanish into thin air. "Where's the woman?" the librarian asked. "I don't see a woman." "She's gone," Jonah said. The librarian narrowed her eyes at him and tilted her head suspiciously. "So what was this?" she said. "Some sort of dare, your audition for drama club? I recommend you do whatever part you're trying out for because you had me convinced. You had me running in my own library." I wasn't lying, Jonah protested. There really were two men in here fighting, and they did seem dangerous, and the librarian tapped her chin, her eyes narrowing further. How did you see what was going on in the conference room before you ran through the door? She asked. Through the glass from the outside, Jonah said, which did have a grain of truth to it. Still, his words came out more like a question. Did someone mention they thought they heard, someone did mention they thought they heard a girl scream back here, but we thought it was a computer game. The librarian seemed to be talking to herself. She reached out and grabbed Jonah's arm. Come with me. We'll do a search through the library, and you can tell me if you see either one of those men. Meekly, Jonah let himself be led through the magazine section, past the computers, past the reference desk, through the little kid section where the mother with the toddler was talking with exaggerated patience. What will it be? Curious George or Cat in the Hat? In the young adult section, some kids from school were playing on computers, and they pointed and giggled when they saw Jonah being paraded around, his arm trapped in the librarian's grip. I don't see either of the men now, Jonah said, his face burning with shame. He wanted to get out of the library. He wanted to get away from the librarian. He could see Chip and Catherine standing beside the front door, as if they weren't sure to come in and rescue him or not. And we're going to stop there. Till next time.